Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending what part of the country you're in today. My name is Kim Sager, and I am the VP of Marketing and Communications. It's been a great Fleet Management Awareness Month, and we are ready for our final webinar for the month. Looking forward to it. Today we're going to be hearing an introduction to the new ASTM standard guide for motorized equipment. Our speaker today is Scott Conlon, and I'm going to give you a little brief bio about him. Scott is a managing director at the fleet management consulting firm Mercury Associates. He's worked on projects for clients representing federal, state, local government fleets, and was formerly a fleet administrator and fleet maintenance manager at Montgomery County. He currently holds 2 fleet management certifications, the NPVA Certified Federal Fleet Manager and the NASA Certified Automotive Fleet Manager. While he was actively involved in maintenance shops, he was also certified as an ASE Master Technician. And before I have Scott chime in here, just a couple administrative things. This is a recorded webinar, and we will post the recording up on our NPMA YouTube channel. If you do have questions throughout the presentation, if you go ahead and type those into the chat box in the GoToMeeting, then we will get those answered for you towards the end. And if you're in a room listening on the call today with anybody else that would like to get the CEU credits, go ahead and email myself. This is Kim Sager again at vpmarketing@mpma.org, and we'll make sure to get those people in the room credit. So, Scott, welcome.
Okay, thank you, Kim, for the introduction. As she mentioned, we're going to talk about the ASTM standard guide for motorized equipment. And as an overview of what we're going to talk about today, I want to briefly cover uses for motorized equipment in the federal government. We want to talk about the review of the Government Accountability Office heavy equipment study that was conducted about 1.5 years or 2 years ago, and what they found. We'll talk about the ASTM International Standard Guide for Motorized Equipment, and that's a newly published document from ASTM International. Just a little note about ASTM International. They were formerly known as the American Society of Testing and Materials. They've, I guess, undergone a name change to broaden the scope and promote these consensus-based standards to an international audience rather than exclusively marketing to an American audience. And then obviously we'll conclude. Here are some examples of the types of equipment that are actually in the federal fleet. And when I use a federal fleet, I'm referring to the off-road types of equipment that you see here on the screen. Typically we think of fleet vehicles as being on-road assets, but one of the key distinctions in the manner that the federal government manages its different assets that's different from, say, some state or local governments is that there is a regulatory framework around how these assets are managed. And because of that regulatory framework, we might only think of fleet vehicles as pertaining to fast reportable vehicles, which is a federal automotive statistical tool reportable vehicles, and those are on-road assets. But there is a whole large plethora of off-road assets that the federal government is using. So here's some examples. We have on the left-hand side what's typically an agricultural tractor, John Deere type, being used by some park personnel out at Yellowstone National Park. We also have on the right-hand side of the screen something called a snowcat, which is an off-road, all-terrain type vehicle that's mostly used for traveling over snow. And they have the Marines have a training area at Bridgeport, which is in the high mountains of California. So they obviously need some specific types of assets to help support those training missions. Other examples of off-road or construction type equipment that is not fast or portable. We have on the left-hand side, we see an example of an Air Force tow tractor that was previously used to move aircraft around an airstrip. On the right-hand side, we have an aerial lift that's used for Department of Energy research. We have forklifts that are being used by the Defense Logistics Agency. And also, kind of on the bottom of the screen, we're looking at the bed of a John Deere Gator, which is kind of a little off-road type vehicle that's used for moving small amounts of material around. In this case, they're using it to transport water for hurricane relief. So there's a lot of types of assets out there, and as I mentioned, there's a system for on-road assets called FAST, the Federal Automotive Statistical Tool. There's not a corresponding system for off-road assets or motorized, what we're calling motorized assets. And what the result of that is that the federal government doesn't necessarily have a comprehensive view of the size and cost of the off-road asset fleet. And for that reason, the Government Accountability Office became involved and evaluated that issue and published a study. Quoting from the study, federal agencies use heavy equipment such as cranes and forklifts to carry out their missions, but there is no government-wide data on federal agencies' acquisition or management of this equipment. The study goes on to say, GAO was asked by Congress to review federal agencies' management of heavy equipment. This report, among other objectives, examines the number, type, and costs of heavy equipment items that are owned by 20 federal agencies and the heavy equipment that selected agencies recently acquired, as well as how they decided whether to purchase or lease this equipment. So they were going at it kind of from a slant of how do agencies make decisions about buying or leasing these types of assets. But in the process, they had to gather a lot of information about the quantities of the assets that are out there. So this pie chart from that study shows that the majority of these types of assets we're discussing here are actually owned by the Department of Defense. Obviously, they have a lot of material handling equipment, thinking of, say, the Defense Logistics Agency, aviation ground support equipment, obviously used to move aircraft around to support the missions of the primary service branches of the Department of Defense. And then obviously other agencies have assets as well, like Department of Agriculture, Interior, Veterans Affairs, and then a broad category of other agencies. Here we have the same type of information presented in a table format, but also showing what the total cost in millions of 2016 dollars is. So we're not saying that all of those assets were purchased in 2016. It's just that those are the assets that they purchased, and then those dollars were converted using an inflation factor to arrive at a common dollar value for 2016. Obviously, we see again, Department of Defense has over $5 billion worth of these assets. Agriculture has 404 million, and so on. But essentially, the key number here is that there are 136,000 of these assets out in the federal fleet, and that kind of compares to the federal fleet on-road inventory that's comprised of around 600,000 assets, slightly more than 600,000 assets. So, you know, adding these off-road assets on top of that, we're now looking at a fleet size of almost 750,000 assets. So this is a significant chunk of assets to manage. It's also a significant chunk of expenditure to acquire and sustain these assets. And then obviously there are We're just looking at acquisition costs here. There are other implications on operating costs like fuel, maintenance and repair, et cetera. Now, more about the breakdown of the types of assets that were found in this study. 38% were construction, mining, excavating, and highway maintenance equipment. 24% were airfield specialized trucks and trailers. Another almost quarter of the off-road assets were self-propelled warehouse trucks and tractors. They have other tractors. And then they actually have soil preparation and harvesting equipment. There are a lot of really niche and specialized applications for these assets. We don't typically think of the federal government as being in the practice of farming. But for example, the Smithsonian Institution has to raise crops to feed animals at the National Zoo. So it would follow that they have to have the types of equipment needed to actually run a farming operation. So there are just some unique examples that folks might not think about when they just think of what type of off-road assets might the federal government have in its inventory. So there's obviously new interest in this area from the GAO, and obviously there's a large number of assets out there which would indicate that agencies should start thinking about what their management practices are around the use of these different types of motorized equipment. So the next question would be, where can I go for guidance on motorized equipment? And this is kind of the genesis of the ASTM standard that was recently produced. So ASTM International developed a voluntary consensus standard that addresses considerations for effectively managing fleets of motorized mobile equipment assets. The standard guide for motorized equipment describes the various aspects of a motorized equipment management program. Now, I'm not going to go into a big backstory on ASTM International or voluntary consensus standards, but essentially I'll sum it up as saying that this document can be used as a guidance document to help your organization. Some applications of it might be that if you're contracting out for a contractor to actually provide some sort of equipment management, you might want to reference a voluntary consensus standard. But just for the purposes of providing yourself an internal checklist, this is a good place to start. Now, if you want more information on ASTM International or how voluntary consensus standards are applied with references of how that occurs within the federal government and citing OMB bulletins or the public laws that reference voluntary consensus standards, you can go to npma.org. And there's actually a presentation on this that was presented at the NES back in 2019. And there's the navigation links to go actually find that presentation and get that information and that back history on ASTM. Okay, so now getting into the actual content of the standard guide for motorized equipment. The process, just briefly, is that ASTM produces voluntary consensus standards. Those standards are produced by a committee process and voted on before publication, and they contain the basic elements of the motorized equipment management program. So the topic areas contained within the standard itself are the scope, the documents that are referenced by the standard, terminology, a summary, some information on the significance of the standard and its use, decision processes that agencies should utilize when thinking about different aspects of their motorized equipment management programs, those aspects themselves of a motorized equipment program, and also keywords that are referenced in the fleet management industry and are discussed in the standard. Sections 1 through 3 are really brief. Actually, I should say the entire standard itself is brief. It's a 4-page document, so it's not some huge volume of references. Like I said, it's a framework. It discusses all the different subject matter areas that somebody should be looking at. So it's brief in nature. So the first section covers the scope. Like I said, those are the considerations for effectively managing motorized mobile equipment assets. The second section covers all the documents that are referenced by this standard. It actually points back to 5 predecessor ASTM standards and also references the GAO report that I just mentioned, and introduces terminology. Motorized equipment is a grouping of similar powered operated assets designed for off-road and construction purposes. So we're trying to build somewhat of a common terminology or common set of definitions around what motorized equipment is, because it can vary by who you ask, because there are so many different types of motorized equipment out there. Some folks might refer to it by different terminology. So we're trying to maybe standardize a little bit on how we refer to these things. The next section is the summary of the guide. Organizations are able to realize significant cost savings and increases in efficiency when motorized equipment assets are managed strategically and holistically. Okay, organizations are able to realize significant cost savings and increases in efficiency when management of a motor vehicle fleet and management of motorized equipment assets fall under the same management group. So just looking at these, what is being stated in this standard is that there are very similar processes that are used between managing on-road assets and motorized assets that are off-road assets. They all have capital costs up front, how much it takes to buy these vehicles. They can all potentially be leased. All of them have, you should monitor how much they're being utilized to ensure that you don't have any underutilized assets in your fleet. So there are a lot of different and similar, or there are a lot of similar management processes around the effective management of these. So it would almost make sense that if you have a group within your organization that's managing your on-road fleet, that they have some relationship or they are the same group that's managing off-road assets. In some organizations, it may not be feasible, but there can be economies of scale that are developed by having one organization operate both fleets. Effective management of motorized equipment assets is multifaceted. An organization can choose the effort and resources dedicated to its management program based on factors such as investment in the assets, the complexity of the assets themselves, and the risks correlated with the availability of the assets. The goal of effective motorized equipment asset management is to maximize the value to the organization while ensuring availability to fulfill the mission and minimize exposure to risks. And the last section, or the last paragraph of that section, the management of motorized equipment may differ from motorized equipment operation. Effective management of motorized equipment incorporates appropriate operational policies and communicates what must be done, and procedures which communicates how to do what must be done. Now, the next section covers the significance and the use of the standard. The guide promotes improved accountability and enhanced operational performance in the context of motorized equipment. Measurement and management of the motorized equipment program can result in cost savings, increased asset visibility and utilization, extended asset life. Sorry, my slide jumped here. Petroleum and greenhouse gas reductions, and increased mission effectiveness. And then Section 6 covers asset decision processes. So they start to break down the process or the different phases of the asset's life cycle, which include the acquisition of the life cycle, the disposal of the life cycle, and then use, which encompasses maintenance and operation. So in the acquisition phase, it's important to determine the types of motorized equipment assets that your organization needs, the acquisition or financing methods. So for example, you might identify a need for an asset, and your organization determines that it's most cost effective to pay cash for that asset and own it for its entire life cycle. Conversely, you may have a need for that asset for a short-term period, and it would be better to rent or lease that asset for a shorter time period and then turn it back in when a particular job is done. You need to have procurement procedures, funds management strategies, and a financing method. Under the presentation started to develop a mind of its own here. Under the use phase, you have managing the operation, utilization, deployment, dispatch, maintenance, and repairs. And under the disposal phase, you have maximizing residual value, which is trying to get as much money as possible for the asset when it is actually sold at the end of its life, and minimizing the costs of preparing the asset for disposal. So can you get rid of the assets efficiently, or is it a laborious process to do so? Section 6 also covers personnel decision processes. Personnel should have the knowledge and expertise to ensure their success at each of the aforementioned stages. One of the things that we'll promote here is that the NPMA organization has a fleet certification and training program, and that a lot of the principles and practices that are discussed in that fleet certification and training program are also applicable to the management of off-road or motorized equipment. And, like I said before, if you know the principles of managing life cycle costs for on-road assets, there's definitely a translation there to being able to understand those for motorized equipment. Management responsibilities should also be very clearly delineated. Section 7.1, operational aspects for consideration. In there, it describes 24 aspects of an effective motorized equipment management program. I'm not going to cover all of them, but essentially, I'm highlighting here that it discusses motorized equipment utilization, right-sizing the motorized equipment fleet, motor pool operations, reporting systems, and training and certification. On section 7.2, the training aspect, there's a bunch of different topic areas, including security, hazardous materials, accident management, laws, regulations, policies. Utilization is an important one, especially for specialized types of assets. Allocation or right sizing. Inventory management, safety and risk management, maintenance and repair, and reporting requirements. And if you see my slide deck jumping around, I think it's somehow PowerPoint has gone into an autopilot mode where it's advancing the slides by itself, so I apologize. Additional training areas are fueling, alternative fuels and fueling, acquisition and disposal, customer relationship management, replacement planning, and total cost of ownership. Trying to figure out how to pause this. Replacement planning, total cost of ownership and budgeting, procurement policies and practices, operation management, short-term rentals. Like I said, that's an important part of utilization management if you have only a short-term requirement for an asset. Costing, determining what the appropriate costs are for those assets and recording those costs. And then also shop mechanic training and management. Do you actually need an in-house maintenance program to manage those assets, or can you rely on vendor support to do so? Section 7.3 covers risk management. The recommendations contained therein prescribe that you should develop a risk management plan that includes the following: what happens with adverse occurrences, mitigating practices that are applied, possibilities, consequences, and frequencies of those occurrences, and the impacts on mission accomplishment. ASTM also has a separate guide or recommended practice that covers risk management as well. And that's a more comprehensive look at those subjects. Now, that kind of covers all the different subject matter areas that are contained in the ASTM standard. So, like I said, it's not a very long document, but circling back to some of the topics that are contained in the standard, specifically 7.1.15, which discusses utilization. Here, some of the recommendations that I would highlight would be to avoid retaining or replacing underutilized assets. Just as you would with a vehicle allocation methodology study for on-road assets, you would probably want to use the same types of processes for off-road assets. This can be accomplished by using various measures such as hour meter readings. Most off-road assets don't have an odometer. They actually have an hour meter, which measures hours of engine operation. Days of usage per month or per year, or the minimum number of times that the equipment is dispatched. What is the cost per hour for operating that equipment? And can that be compared to rates for comparable types of equipment that can be sourced from commercial providers? Other consideration factors are work stoppage dependencies, which are when a lack of availability causes other equipment or personnel to be affected. Optimizing utilization becomes less important. Or would also want to consider what is the lead time to providing substitute equipment. So what I mean by work stoppage dependencies is, for example, if you have a crew that is all dispatched at once to go and pave a road, and you have a paving machine and you have a roller, what can happen is if one piece of that equipment breaks down, like the roller, it can actually idle both the paving machine, the dump truck that's carrying, or the set of dump trucks that's carrying the material, the personnel that are out there operating the equipment. So there can be a small interruption or service interruption with a piece of equipment, a breakdown, can have more cost associated with the loss of productivity than the actual repairs to the equipment. And that's problematic mostly because this equipment is specialized and the organization may not have multiple pieces of equipment, so there may not be as much redundancy there. And again, consider performing a VAM on motorized assets as well as your on-road assets. So here's an example of poor utilization. So I spotted this. I actually saw this piece of equipment at a federal facility. I'll just say it's in the National Capital Region. I'm not going to say where it is or call anybody out. But basically, I saw it. I drive by it, every once in a while, and noticed that there's looks like a front end loader type piece of equipment that was just sitting in the same spot for several months. And it's essentially sitting there like holding up a fence. So obviously, that's a pretty stark illustration of poor utilization there. This particular tractor loader was parked near the front gate of the facility for several months and it never moved. So the question I would ask is, if you're the fleet manager, how successful do you think you would be in asking for replacement funding for other types of equipment if your site director drives in and out of the site every day and sees that this is what you're doing with this equipment? You're holding up a fence. There may have been some valid reasons for that. I don't know, but obviously it begs some questions. Okay, before buying equipment, what you might consider is the overall demand. Demand can be constant for certain types of equipment like forklifts that are operating in a warehouse, or they can be extremely intermittent like paving equipment. consider required equipment response times. So some equipment may be needed for unplanned events like water main breaks or snow emergencies, and other equipment is not associated with any type of emergency response. Also consider personnel qualifications before acquiring complex or potentially dangerous equipment. Some equipment can be dangerous in the hands of unqualified employees or when used only intermittently. Forklifts are a prime example of this. Employees should be qualified and certified to operate forklifts. The problem being that in many scenarios, a forklift is usually left sitting in an area where other employees may have access to it, and the key may be left in the ignition. So somebody might be inclined to, not having ever had any training, they might be inclined to jump on the forklift and attempt to drive it to offload something off of the truck. And they're unfamiliar with the handling characteristics and the weight characteristics of the vehicle or the forklift, and can cause significant injuries or property damage. So those are definitely important things to consider. Is, do you even want that type of equipment in your environment? And if you can avoid it, you know, does that have any safety mitigating consequences? Other things to consider here are federal reporting for the equipment. Like I said previously, federal government has a lot of different reporting systems for different types of mobile assets. More broadly speaking about mobile assets, agency aircraft are reported via a specific system. Agency on-road vehicles are reported annually via the FAST tool. Agency fleet management information systems should be used to track heavy equipment, but the requirement to do so is likely internal to the agency. Like I said, there's no overarching, federal equipment statistical tool or something like that. And then just going back into my background and the introduction, I was introduced as having worked for Montgomery County government. I worked for the transit section, and we received federal funding to purchase transit buses. And I somewhat find it ironic that that many non-federal assets that are owned by transit agencies that were funded by the federal government, the Federal Transit Administration, the FTA, that the federal government actually has more detailed information about those types of assets than in many cases the information contained, the information regarding motorized equipment, even though those are assets that the federal government does not technically own. So some of the takeaways here: review motorized equipment management activities against the ASTM international standard. Develop equipment data cost tracking and inventory capabilities, for example, on FMIS. Agencies should develop preventive maintenance programs for motorized equipment. Develop key performance indicators for equipment management. Evaluate equipment utilization through a structured process similar to a FMAM for on-road assets or some other type of utilization review process. And also agencies should analyze life cycle costs and develop long-term fleet replacement plans for those assets, especially important because they are so expensive. And I will take any questions that anybody has.
Let me take a look here. I think at this time, nothing came through while you were giving your presentation, Scott, but let's give it a few minutes in case people need some time to submit.
Okay.
One thing, Rebecca, I know that we always, in our last couple webinars, we have gotten questions relative to the slides and sharing them. So just to reiterate, the webinar will be posted on our NPMA website, the YouTube channel. But again, as Scott presented earlier in the month and was willing to share his presentation, I know I'm speaking for you, Scott, but if they just email you, that you could share that with them if they wanted.
Yes.
we did have some questions come through. The first one is, what are some examples of risk mitigation approaches?
So, so the risk associated with heavy equipment come in a couple different areas. So first, I would talk about availability. So like I said, with the example of a work crew being idled by the fact that one piece of equipment has broken down, there may be, it depends on the utilization of the equipment, but you might have that equipment as an asset of your organization. Or conversely, you could have a contract with a commercial provider, and if you have that contract with a commercial provider and you have a requirement that they're able to provide backup equipment in case one is taken out of service for whatever reason, that would be one risk mitigation strategy. So here's an example, and this is an on-road vehicle example, but it's kind of applicable. When I worked in local government, I had 4 aerial bucket trucks that were used for maintaining traffic signals around the county. And there were actually only 3 technicians that worked on traffic signals. We only had 3 technicians. So we had this 4th truck as a spare. One of the strategies that we used to mitigate the risk of getting rid of that truck in case one of the trucks broke down or was out for preventive maintenance was we ensured that we had a contract in place with a local provider that we could rent a bucket truck and basically use that as our backup in case one was out of service. So that'd be kind of a risk mitigation strategy for the availability of the asset. There's other factors of risk involved. Again, these can be potentially specialized assets that people are unfamiliar with the operation of, or that they are intermittent users of the equipment. So they may not be as familiar with the equipment as they would be with driving their own personal vehicle. So because of that lack of familiarity with the handling characteristics, with the controls of the equipment, it's very important to make sure that the equipment the use of the equipment is restricted to only personnel who are trained in its operation. And even then, you would want to consider, even if somebody's trained, how frequently do they use the equipment? Do they use the equipment with enough regularity that they can operate it safely, or is it something that they've only done every few years or every couple months or whatever? So there can be some risk involved there. And then again, with moving on to the maintenance part of the equipment, one thing that you would want to look at is making sure you have a preventive maintenance program that's tailored to the actual equipment itself. I don't think you could really use a generic preventive maintenance checklist and use it for a very specialized piece of equipment. So there's some risk involved in the equipment not being in the proper operating condition because it isn't being maintained properly. It's not under a good preventive maintenance program. So those are kind of a couple examples and a couple strategies to mitigate those. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you. Another question came through. It says, can you give us the number of the GAO report and the ASTM standard?
Oh, sure. The ASTM standard is E3221-19, and I'm trying to remember the GAO report offhand. Let's see if I can pull that up. I'm thinking it's 18-295, but I'm not 100% sure. Essentially, it's back up here to the top of the presentation. I apologize for omitting that. 18-295. GAO 18-295 is the answer.
Thank you. Here's another question. It says there's a question from an email. They've heard ongoing discussions regarding the use of GSAs, established prices and rates, and whether additional methods of determining price reasonableness are also required when using a GSA. Gosh, actually, it's pretty long. It might be something, whoever sent this one, let me go ahead and actually email it to Scott because it's a very long question, and then he can answer you via the email, unless you want me to read the whole thing, but it's very long. It's up to you, Scott.
If you could just email it to me, I guess.
Okay. Let me see if any others came through here. One more here. It says, by law in 2019, U.S. government agencies must assess during annual inventory of capitalized personal property and periodic inventory of accountable personal property, age, condition, criticality to mission. I guess it's just kind of a statement. They didn't really ask a question. Do you have any response to that, or would you like me to repeat that?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure. It just is a statement that says, by law in 2019, U.S. government agencies must assess during annual inventory of capitalized personal property and periodic inventory of accountable personal property, age, condition, and criticality, how critical it is to the mission.
Right. Well, I guess it sounds to me that that's very similar, I guess, in its aim to conducting a vehicle allocation methodology study. That the idea is that if you're trying to evaluate the criticality of the asset, that that you would take into consideration some of those factors I talked about already of how central the asset is to the organization's mission, how critical it is that they be able to provide that asset either as an emergency response or to unplanned events. And those would all weigh on the agency's decision as to whether they could justify the expense of owning the asset versus either renting the asset for a shorter period of time or sourcing it in some other way, or just contracting out that service altogether to a commercial provider.
And that looks like that's all the questions and comments that have come through.
Okay.
Kim or Scott, back to you.
Well, Scott, great presentation today. I appreciate you speaking during Fleet Management Awareness Month. If there aren't any other questions, I'll go ahead and say that if you have not already participated in our Test Your Fleet Knowledge quiz, you can head on over to the Fleet Management Awareness Month page on our NPMA site and do that. It's open until the end of the month. So go ahead and test your knowledge. And then again, all three of our webinars that happened this month will be posted on our NPMA YouTube channel. So Scott, thanks again for being our speaker, not only today, but also earlier in the month. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a good one. Bye, everybody.
Thanks for attending. Bye-bye.